What is a university's core mission? Is it a place where ideas, even controversial ones, are tested and debated to advance knowledge? What happens when the controversy is freedom of inquiry itself? And what safeguards keep debate open? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
And so I don't know of any issue in which faculty is terrified to speak to the extent that they have been since October 7th.
The most important thing that happened in university is not happening in the classroom. It happens in the corridors. It happens in the library.
Students are sitting there with their cell phones, and they can at any moment take a video of you, and it'll be on the evening news, and you will be destroyed.
Yelling at a speaker is not permitted by, any normal version of academic freedom, so that the speaker can't speak.
Our debate today: have universities begun to favor ideology over truth? I'm joined today by our guests. I'd like to welcome for this discussion Mohammad Fadel, professor of law at the University of Toronto; Pablo Avelluto, the former Minister of Culture for Argentina; Omer Bartov, the Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University; and Dorian Abbot, Professor of Geophysics at the University of Chicago. Welcome to you all. It's really good to have you all. Thank you for being here. Now, we are having this conversation in Argentina. As you know, it's a nation with a proud tradition of student activism, where the idea of academic freedom is deeply ingrained. So it is a great place to raise today's debate question as it impacts students all over the world. Have universities begun to favor ideology over truth? Dorian, you're making eye contact with me. Let's start with you. Let's just dive right in.
Okay. So as I see it, there's sort of two questions at play here. The first is there ideological conformity at the universities? And the second is, does that influence the mission of truth-seeking? And so I'm a scientist, so I decided to look up some data before I came in, and I brought it in some notes. And for the first question, what I found, I should also say that I'm going to address this from an American perspective, and it could be different in other parts of the world. The most straightforward measure of ideology in an American context would be political party membership. And so we can look at that to get a sense of whether there's ideological conformity. In the public at large, there are roughly the same number of Republicans, which would be the right-leaning party, and Democrats, which would be the left-leaning party. According to a study by Langbert 2018 and Langbert and Stevens 2021, there are, in the academy overall, among the faculty, there are 8.5 registered Democrats for every registered Republican, and this varies very widely among fields. So, for example, in two fields, which were anthropology and communications, they weren't able to find a single Republican in the entire survey, which was almost 9,000 faculty. In most fields in the humanities, the ratios were about 40-1 Democrats per Republican, which means that you would have to go to 4 to 5 universities in order to find a single Republican in many of these areas on the faculty. In the sciences, the ratio tended to be 5 to 6-1, and in engineering, it was 3-2, and there was no fields where Republicans outnumbered Democrats. So I think this is to say that the data do indicate that, at least in America, there is ideological conformity among the faculty. I'll let other people comment now, but then the secondary question would be whether this has any influence on the core mission of truth-seeking.
Okay, so you brought your stats. Let's go to you, Pablo, because you mentioned you were talking about this in an American context. So, in Argentina.
I think everywhere there's no universities without ideology. You cannot think of universities with no ideology, with no ideologies. But that don't mean, in my point of view, to silence truth. A university that silences truth shouldn't exist. That's the because what happened to Dorian, I know many years ago, was canceling voices is not to win arguments. It's quite the opposite. In Argentina, we have a sad tradition of canceling arguments. We had dictatorships that brought teachers to exile and also to death, and that and we have a guaranteed academic freedom, but I should be ingenious if I don't acknowledge the things that Dorian has said. That there is a disbalance, but I don't think that is that you're going to solve that paradox bringing out ideologies, because that's another ideology in a way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're scribbling notes, Professor. What are you scribbling? What are you thinking?
Well, the several points I think that need to be looked at, really. First of all, I agree with the idea that having neutrality at the university, being neutral, trying not to have ideology at the university would be largely, to use a common term, fake. You can't have neutrality, because if you have a university in which there are many people who are thinking and working and involved in social and intellectual issues, they will have opinions, and they should have opinions. We don't want people who don't have opinions, people who are just Teflon. So that's the first thing. The second thing about ideology at the university. So obviously, as I said, you will have ideology at the university, or ideologies, and sometimes some will predominate and sometimes others. That's different from having universities that are under ideological rule. And we have many such cases in the past where people at the university will find that they have to conform to a particular ideology, and if they don't, they might lose their jobs or worse. And so we have to think about which ideology we are talking about. Is it people's opinions, or is it the opinion of the state, or some kind of predominant opinion that also has power behind it? I'd also say one other thing, that at universities as such, opinions tend to shift, and there is a tendency to speak about radical left universities. Universities are bastions of the left or of liberalism. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. As you know, I come from Israel, although I've been teaching in the United States for many years, but I follow events in Israel very closely. So in Israel, for instance, the student body is much more to the right of the faculty by far. And the government is much more to the right than the faculty. And the faculty itself has shifted to the right, although in a less extreme manner, and more the administrations have. In Germany, in the early 1930s, the student association was taken over by the Nazis, not by fiat, because the Nazis were not in power yet, but because the students shifted dramatically to the right. And so it is not at all the case that necessarily universities would be more to the right or more to the left. They reflect certain trends in society. And the final thing I just want to say, specifically about American universities, one thing that maybe needs to be looked at is not only the extent to which there are more Democrats than Republicans, but where are faculty coming from? Where are you recruiting faculty from? Why is it the case? Is it because the faculty or the universities choose people with a particular opinion? because there's more of them, so they want people who think like them? Or is it also because of an educational system that produces a certain result? And maybe it's the educational system that has to be looked at for producing people who are more inclined to have this kind of opinion than another. And I think in the United States, there are major issues within the educational system itself, starting in elementary school and high school, leading to universities.
Several gems there. I want to kick it over to you, Professor.
Well, I think a university is a place, an institution that's unique in our society because it's dedicated to pursuing truth and allowing the faculty to be the exclusive judges of the merit of the research that's involved. Ideology is a political criteria for judging the output of scholars. So if we want to ask, has politics intruded into the governance of universities in the United States and Canada, the answer is obviously yes. And that's been a result not because of the faculty is one-sided in favoring a particular party over another, but because politicians and donors are insisting on interfering in the output of scholars. That's seen most clearly in the attacks on critical race studies, on gender studies, and Middle Eastern studies, where there's been this imposition of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which wasn't even intended for this function, but has now been appropriated to censor scholarly output and, in fact, even shut departments down, not based on the merit of the scholarly production, but because of a political claim that the output of the scholarship has an incidental effect of anti-Semitism, right? So that itself, of course, is a claim that can be measured and refuted or affirmed. But what's not at issue for the folks who are sort of supporting this is they're not challenging the meritorious nature of the scholarship itself, right? They want to shut down the scholarship because of the political consequences of it rather than the truth of the scholarship. So that's a clear instance, the clearest instance, I think, of ideology interfering in the work of scholars in North America. Because we have the same problem in Canada, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in on one issue that I think is important? And I've sort of become much more aware of it only in the last few years. I teach at a sort of elite university, right, Ivy League, and these universities have generally made a claim to being diverse, being open, being liberal. But when a crisis arrived, and that crisis was after October 7th and the demonstrations by students and encampments, something was revealed about the nature of these universities, and that is their business model. And their business model does not reflect the way they present themselves publicly. That is, they're highly dependent on donors, and they are, it turns out, also highly dependent on federal funds for research. And so whatever is the opinion of the president or the faculty or the provost, when donors, who tend to be more conservative, put their foot down, the university has to decide, is it going to take huge losses and actually have to change the nature of its operations, or does it conform or at least adapt to some extent to these pressures? And that's part of a long-term decision that has been made by these universities to change their business model so that, for instance, tuitions, since I started teaching in the United States several decades ago, have gone through the roof. This whole model, if it does not adapt to what we've seen now, if it does not change dramatically, must lead to these results that those who have money will actually be behind the glossy brochures of diversity and progress.
Well, then, before we get too much deeper, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. What is the purpose of a university?
I think we're in agreement
Yeah.
that the university, the purpose of it is to pursue truth and to give scholars the freedom to pursue truth and to only be held accountable to other scholars based on scholarly criteria, not political criteria. I think all of us are in agreement with that, on that proposition.
I would just add, yes, of course, the pursuit of truth, of course, is subjective because we can argue about the truth of one thing or another. To my mind, the university as an institution has to challenge what we believe is truth, has to challenge conventions. It's a place that allows people, should allow people to say things, think things, and teach ideas and concepts that may seem outrageous, unacceptable. That's what the university should be about.
If I could follow up on that, I mean, if you were to look at the mission statement of the University of Toronto, I could share it with you after when we're done. It says that expressly, that this has to be a place where scholars are allowed to raise the most troubling questions, right? And that the university is a site where radical critique is permitted and accepted, right? And of course, this creates a tension with, as Professor Bartov was mentioning, the political economy of the university. For reasons that I don't fully understand, our commitment as a public in North America to higher education has declined dramatically since I was an undergraduate student. And as a result, universities, both public and private, have become increasingly dependent on donors. And these donors have politics that are not necessarily consistent with the mission of the university.
Yeah, in Argentina, things are a little different because the main universities are public funded. So the problem is not the politics of the donors, as you said, it's the politics of the government. So when the government is, as is happening now, extreme right-wing government, libertarian government, the problem with universities is there are lots of demonstrations because universities need to have their budgets to keep on an economy run by high rates of inflation. But there's also an ideological problem with public university, public access to higher education, and the idea we are listening every day that there's a lot of ideology and mostly leftist ideologies in universities, and maybe the statistical, from a statistical point of view, things are the same in humanistic, more progressive teachers, more progressive students than conservative ones, but I think that the challenge is how to think on that, how to solve that, because it's who is going to say what politics are the correct, whose politics are the correct, and as Omer said, the way you choose your teachers, the way you choose your professors, the things you take in account are very important, and that, as Mohammad said, must be run by scholarship, not by ideology.
Can I add a couple things?
Please.
Yeah. This issue of who pays, who's paying is actually really important. There's a great essay by Russell Kirk 65 years ago where he points out that all of this federal money was just starting to pour into universities and it was going to have a terrible impact eventually. And there are some institutions that refuse to take any federal money, either loans, student loans, or direct grants for research. And that does allow them to be a bit more independent. And that's something that at a high level, I think a lot of these universities need to think about. Like, maybe all of us faculty need to teach a bit more and depend less on external stuff. And one more point. And the other point is about neutrality. So I 100% agree that every student, every faculty should be advancing their perspective on every issue. But I think it's important for the institution to stay neutral. Because if the president starts speaking ex officio and saying this is the institution's view on this, it restricts the ability of people being paid or depending to get a degree on the university from expressing their opinion. And this is the principle of institutional neutrality specified in the Calvin Report of the University of Chicago. So that's just a slight distinction I want to make.
Should the university stay neutral?
Can I just follow up on that? Of course, I agree that the university should not take positions on political issues, except when the university itself is under attack. When the university itself is under attack, the university has every right and duty to defend the integrity of the institution.
No matter who it's under attack from?
Yes. What I would just, one small comment on Dorian's point about federal funding. I just want to point out as a lawyer, what the Trump administration is doing vis-a-vis American universities is blatantly illegal, right? Title VI has provisions that are supposed to apply when, in theory, the grantee is not following the rules of the Department of Education. They've completely ignored that. So they are playing, for lack of a better term, power politics with American universities. And what they are showing is that the law is too weak to stop the president from using the power of the purse to bend universities to his will, which is very dangerous. Same thing. Donors don't have a de jure right to tell universities what to do. What they are exercising is extra legal authority that our political economy affords them. And, I'll just finish up on this last point. My youngest daughter just graduated from Berkeley a couple of years ago.
Congratulations.
Well, I'm very proud of her. But, when she started as a freshman, I was struck by how much money it was going to cost to send her as an out-of-state student to Berkeley. Now, I was an out-of-state student at University of Virginia. I started in 1984. So out of curiosity, I went back and looked, right? Because I'm, a scholar. I like to see statistics. And at that time in 1984, I think I found out that going to UVA, even as an out-of-state student, was expensive for my parents, but it was maybe something like 10% of their pre-tax money. For me, sending my daughter to Berkeley was going to be something like 25 or 30% of my pre-tax money, right? I mean, we're not a poor family. We're upper middle class, very comfortable, right? Also, what was very important or significant, at the time in 1984, out-of-state UVA was maybe about half of what it cost to go to Harvard. Now it's basically the same. And this is what I'm talking about, the complete collapse of public support for higher education. It's a mystery to me because I think of education, maybe because I'm a professor, as a great thing. And normally in economics, we think when a society becomes more affluent, it spends more money on luxury goods. So it's a paradox to me that the most affluent society in the world is spending less and less of its output educating its people.
Can I make one point about that, about the dynamics of how donors can influence things? So typically, like a university will announce, we got a $150 million donation from, Mr. X. But what they actually got is a commitment to $150 million over 10 or 15 years. And so what happens is then Mr. X comes in and says, I don't like what you guys are doing. I'm pulling back the money unless you do what I want. So that's usually how the pressure is exerted in that situation.
Omer, you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a number of points. I also want to start with a sort of personal story. I went as an undergraduate to Tel Aviv University. And I think the tuition was maybe $1,000 for the whole year. Wow. And I got a very good education there. And I'm talking about the 1970s. My wife is from Hong Kong, and she went to university there and got a very good education. I mean, I ended up at Oxford, and she ended up at Princeton from our undergraduate institutions, and she paid nothing for that. And she still says, our daughter went to Brown, and I don't think that my daughter got a better education than either my wife or I. But we at the time paid several tens of thousands of dollars, and since then, and my daughter is 30, the tuition has doubled. So that's something that, as you were saying, that is so important that we have now a system that costs so much money, that is so much geared to elites, even as the country has become richer. And why is that happening? So I think, as Dorian was saying, it is very important to remember that in the aftermath of World War II, it was discovered that the university and what later President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex could work together. And the university, in many ways, became a training ground for technologies, for engineering, for everything that makes for that complex. So it became increasingly connected to corporations. it became in large part a corporate university with some islands that kept still, you teach history, you teach philosophy, you teach literature, but that's not where most of the money is going to. The money and the control comes from there. And American universities, although, say, Brown is private, Harvard is private, they are highly dependent because of that on the government as well. So their dependency is both on donors. They need a lot of money from donors who tend to be more conservative and who know how to put pressure, because they, by the way, are connected with how you appoint presidents, for instance. And presidents make a lot of money and want to keep their jobs, I'm afraid to say. And they depend on the government. We saw now what happened when President Trump said, I'm taking away your research funds. Whether it's legal or not, of course, is up for grabs, I guess, but it is an imminent danger. You can't have research because that money is coming from the government. And so in that sense, this model that was created after World War II has now reached a point where the universities are completely vulnerable to these kind of pressures, and these areas of different kind of intellectual pursuit, something that you cannot translate into immediate rewards. It's not technology, it's not engineering, it's not physics, it is history, it's philosophy, it's ideas that may or may not mean more than a hell of beans. Those are the first to go away, and we are seeing it right now. We're seeing universities, and I can say that about my university and others, where the emphasis is beginning to shift. And it's all in the name of not enough money for this. That is destroying the university as at least people like me understand it and what it is supposed to be. It's not meant to train people to do things that are immediately applicable. It's meant to do exactly the opposite. That's the origin of the university. That's where it started in the Middle Ages. It's to think about other things, not to think about how you plow, not to think about how you build a bridge. That may have an effect on that too, but it doesn't start there.
You know the etymology. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Maybe the problem is intolerance, is the difficulty, the lack of pluralism, the difficulty to empathize with other points of view. That's what I think this tensions between governments and universities, donors and universities, students and the universities too are. This is something you can think of, it has always been there, but now it has grown at a dramatic level, I think.
If I could just make a comment on Omer's point. I mean, the university originated, at least in the West, as part out of the liberal tradition. Liberal not in the political sense, but liberal in the open-minded sense, that this is a place where you go and you expand your knowledge for the sake of knowledge, not because there's some sort of instrumental value from learning sort of the core curriculum, right? It's just supposed to make you sort of a better human being, so to speak. And you did that, at least initially, by studying the classics, Greek, Latin, grammar. There was a sort of a classical canon, some philosophy, literature, etc. We are losing that very rapidly. So when I graduated from college in 1988 at UVA, University of Virginia, the largest undergraduate major was English. By far, the most popular undergraduate major was English. Today, I think it's economics, and I think you see that in lots of top universities. Things like English, philosophy, history, enrollment has cratered. The only place where history remains viable, as far as I can tell, in American universities is in the most elite schools. Because
why do you think that is?
Because I think students believe, rightly or wrongly, that if they major in something that doesn't have instrumental value in the marketplace, they're going to be stuck with huge amounts of student loan debt, and they'll never be able to get out from under it.
You know how many of my students who are studying history, they concentrate in history and then they go to law school. That's
so they get the best of both worlds.
Well, yes, but we lose out because they're brilliant.
A couple points on that. So I mean, part of this is a consequence of the expansion of to more people of a college education. And so what we find at the University of Chicago is that our first generation students, the first of their family to go to college, are very unlikely to major in more esoteric subjects. You know, they feel like I got to make some money for my family, and they're getting a lot of pressure from their parents. So that's one issue. Another issue that I see at play is that from the outside, it looks like the humanities have lost confidence in themselves. And so they're no longer willing to say, I'm going to do something useless because it's amazing. And what I wanted to mention to you is that the origin of liberal arts is actually, the etymology is free from use. Liberal as in free from use. And that was celebrated. No. And I see that a turn towards things like activism as an example of saying, look, I don't really value just reading literature for literature. I have to read it from this critical perspective or that critical perspective. And if they return to just saying, this is an amazing piece of work that I just want to share with you, I think that'll attract more students. That's my perspective.
Mohammad, what do you think about that last point?
Not terribly persuaded by it. I mean, what immediately came to my mind was Edward Said. So Edward Said was a great, great, great lover of English literature, a critical reader of literature, showed how so much of the literature that we read and enjoy so much from the 19th century is built on certain assumptions about colonial relations. All these are very insightful readings of the literature, but it doesn't take away from your enjoyment of it, nor does it preclude being an activist. Edward Said is a model of the scholar activist who was excellent in all domains. So I don't think activism is the opposite of scholarship, right? Of course it can be, right? But it doesn't have to be. And I don't think that a teacher who teaches students how to engage in texts beyond the level of the sheer aesthetic enjoyment of it is turning them away from the aesthetic enjoyment of it. I think it's possible to enjoy the Iliad and also read it critically.
Well, it's the instrumentalization, though, when it gets pushed too far so that we're only reading it in order to advance some agenda. I think that's when it becomes a problem.
How do you know when that's happened?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of these things are sort of qualitative, and you have to, use your judgment. But I think that's what some of the students are picking up on, and which is turning them off from those subjects.
Yeah, look, I mean, I want to start by saying that the 19th century university, and certainly American colleges, liberal colleges, had a particular philosophy, but that's not the origin of the university. The university begins much earlier than that. And it's actually a very conservative institution. It's a corporation. It deals with theology, later with philosophy. It's very elitist. It is a place where scholars meet and talk about issues that are not of daily concern, that are divine, that are philosophical. That's where the university begins. And there are remnants of that in the university to this day. Universities as such, and that's a big debate, but by and large, universities are elite institutions. They're not democratic. They're hierarchical institutions. Full professors decide whether assistant professors get tenure or not. It's not put up to a vote by everyone. So much of this has to do with a particular tradition, and one can criticize it. And there have been attempts to liberalize universities, not in the sense of being more liberal, but of being more democratic. And that has not always succeeded because they're based on the idea that there are people who have studied more, who have more experience, and they determine whether other people can join them in this sort of corporate body. That's one thing that I think is important to recognize, not that it's the best aspect of universities, but it is a reality of universities. Another thing that Dorian spoke about, not only here, and I think has to be taken into account, and I've seen that myself, and I know many of my colleagues, there has been, over the last 2 decades, before this recent shift in American politics, a predilection for political correctness at universities that I think many people certainly of my generation, but also younger people, felt that they were subjected to, that there were things that they could not say, that there were thoughts that they could not entertain, that the idea that universities are places where you challenge any kind of conformism, whichever it is, didn't really work so well. Because you might not get promoted, because you were supposed to profess your predilection for diversity. So that was part of a university culture. And we have to admit that if we want to see where the university is going now, because the backlash, which I think is much, much worse than the problem it supposedly wanted to fix, can actually destroy the university. Whereas this earlier version of the politically correct university, which was anti-intellectual from my point of view.
Because universities shouldn't be politically correct.
Of course
It
not.
must be, because they must challenge, they must think against themselves,
Yes.
not...
And that is a problem that you can find in different places. This was one phase of it. This is not the first time that there was political correctness. You can look at universities in Eastern Europe under communism. There were things you could say and things you couldn't say. And they were good in some things, but terrible in other things, because there was control of speech.
Sure.
The control of speech now, which is coming from the government rather than from the faculty, is obviously much worse. And that can really undermine the universities as such and bring them to a place of the ideological university according to the ideology of the government and of those who have money.
You have all faced pressure for your positions or for things you have said. So, Mohammad, I know you want to get in here, but several people now have raised the case, I shall say, of what happened to you, Dorian. So I feel like we should just tell us that story.
Well, the first thing that happened to me was I tried to say in my department that I felt we were having trouble talking about difficult issues related to DEI programs. And then...
For our international audience.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry about that. There were some aspects of the DEI programs that I was uncomfortable with, in particular, limiting what people could say or think, and in certain cases, making it very hard to hire people of certain or admit people of certain ethnic backgrounds. So I tried to raise those issues, and then the response was that a bunch of graduate students in my department tried to make it so I couldn't teach any classes and stuff like this, and have it host and mentor any graduate students. They wrote a letter asking this. I was also supposed to go get a sort of a retraining in how to think about things and stuff like that. So the University of Chicago said, no, we're not doing that. The President Zimmer at the time, he's since died, was the president. He didn't mention me in particular, but just issued a statement saying our faculty can say what they think, and that was the end of that. But then kind of in the aftermath of this, I had been invited to give a lecture at MIT, and like a special lecture for my field, a public-facing lecture. And then sort of once my views were out there, they sort of rescinded the invitation. And then I ended up speaking at Princeton. So it's not like this isn't. A lot of people have had much worse experiences with this stuff, but that was my experience.
Mohammad, do you want to get in?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what Omer raised. When I spoke about the mission of the university, I was speaking about it from a philosophical perspective, from what Kant would say, what makes academic freedom distinct from something else, right? But we also have to look at universities as a social institution, right? At least in the North American context, at least in the United States, which I'm much more familiar with since I'm American. I grew up there, even though I've been teaching in Canada for almost 20 years. The university is also a gatekeeper to social opportunity and economic opportunity. And given the politics of race in the United States, and given the way that our law has developed over the last 30 years, it was the last institution that was still permitted to play a remedial role in correcting racial injustices. Even that has been taken away now. Now, I sometimes would have discussions with my daughter about DEI and affirmative action, et cetera, and she was more critical of it than I was. But I would point out that affirmative action in practice is a very weak response to a history of racial injustice in the United States. And it was in fact introduced by Richard Nixon as a compromise solution to try to mollify sort of the civil rights movement. And even that was gradually struck down in all places but higher education, where the Supreme Court for a long time tolerated it as a factor, right? I think one of the problems that we have in universities in North America is the university is kind of expected to play lots of roles where other institutions are completely failing, right? I mean, if we had, for example, if affirmative action were constitutionally permissible in the United States, which, by the way, just for the record, the United States is a complete outlier in international law on this, right? So the convention, the Universal Convention the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has an express carve-out for affirmative action, right? So the United States is completely by itself on the view that affirmative action is racial discrimination, right? And we could have easily had a totally different history. There are some fundamental cases that went 5-4. So 5 is the minimum majority for the international audience in Supreme Court decisions. If they had gone the other way and affirmative action had been institutionalized, you could have had much more robust remedial actions in other sectors, and the university would not have been affected by this, because it would not have been the only social institution that existed to address racial inequalities in the country. But because it was forced to bear this load, it couldn't do it all, and I understand all the backlash that resulted from it. But it's not because of universities or anything. It was because society put all this weight on the universities, which universities could not bear.
I want to touch on this issue because that's something that I've been struggling with for a long time. I came to the U.S. in '89, and at some point I was given these kind of forms of affirmative action, and to me, they were completely weird, I have to say, because I had to define myself racially. And everything that I'd studied until then, I was in my mid-30s, was that race is something that people have invented. I'm not actually racially defined, and I had to do that. And I said, but what race am I? Am I Caucasian? And then there was a category there that said Caucasian, including from the Middle East. And I thought, okay, that must be me, and I filled that out. And what that told me was that the problem with affirmative action based on race was that it affirmed race. And it affirmed a category of human beings defined biologically. Now, yes, it said it, of course, has got social aspects to it clearly, but it defined people on the basis of race. It worked in some cases. Affirmative action at the universities worked very well, I think, for women. There was a huge improvement, and I saw it throughout the years that I've been in the United States, in the representation of women students, women faculty, women professors, women administrators. There was a huge, still it's not 50-50, but the improvement has been huge. I'm not sure it worked very well with African Americans. It improved and then it stopped, and I remember discussions of a diminishing representation of African Americans in the student body and certainly within the faculty. And there were reasons for this. But the main issue to me was that this whole debate was so as to avoid the real debate, which was about economics, about society, about changing the socioeconomic structures that have changed in America since the 1960s, with growing inequality in education, in housing, in medical assistance, in everything that makes for a more equal society. The gaps has been growing. And you cannot address that gap through racial categories. You have to address it through the issue itself. And that's reflected also within the university itself, both in it being an elite institution, and in how it teaches and thinks about these issues. And to my mind, much of what we see, and I'm generalizing here, but I'll do it anyway, in the United States and also in Europe, has got to do with the failure of the university, of academy, of people who have time to think, who are paid to sit around in their offices and think, to address the main issues of their society, which are socioeconomic, which are the growing economic gap, not the growing racial gap. That racism in many ways, because racism is an invented category, is a tool by the elites to use race as a category that incites people against each other, rather than actually, if you're talking about remedial action should be in having better elementary schools, better high schools, so that you get a better representation of society into universities, not by judging them according to their race, but by providing them better education so that they can apply to those institutions.
Well, this is what I mean about the pathologies of the U.S. legal system. So the Supreme Court, in all its wisdom, said that you could only obtain remedies for past racism, just to put it sort of crudely, from the government that committed the unlawful acts. So in the U.S., in the United States generally, education is financed at the local level, right? So that meant that if a particular county ran a segregated school system, the victims of that segregation could only seek a remedy from the county government. Now, counties are very small. They're very local. And so what ended up happening is that whites would move from those counties to other counties, right? And the Supreme Court said, well, you can't hold the state responsible. So it ended up that there was no place that was held responsible for the, let's leave aside the 300 years of slavery, then the 100 years of Jim Crow, right? And so there's massive underinvestment in the kinds of public infrastructure that would benefit African-American students. So race may be a social category, but that doesn't make it any less real.
Right.
And this is where how universities were sort of left holding the bag. There was this idea that somehow universities could make up for 18 years of neglect that happened before and make everything magically work out, when actually what was needed is much greater investment in the lives of the racially marginalized. But the legal system prohibited us from doing that.
Yeah, and the last time it happened was the GI Bill, and then the Great Society. There was a notion the United States had an enviable school system that people around the world looked at. And what happened to that system? Where did it go? So it went through these local pressures and through the retreat of government into what we see now, which is a highly unequal educational system that cannot produce equality at the university.
And it also distorts truth. So I grew up in a small town in Georgia. Georgia, for the international audience, was part of the Confederacy, Deep South, plantation economy, large amount of slaves until the Civil War. After Civil War, they instituted Jim Crow. Yet in my education in high school and junior high, I learned nothing about this.
Wow.
You completely covered up. So it's
That's
erased
ideology.
from the consciousness.
That's ideology.
It's erased from the consciousness
Yes.
of the people of Georgia. So it also, the educational system is sort of designed to prevent the kind of consciousness that would be required to mobilize public resources to ameliorate these past injustices.
If it begins there, then how can students be expected, once they reach these elite echelons of a university or college, to then unpack these kinds of discussions that we're having here if they never even learned about it?
It's very disturbing to them, obviously. It's very disturbing because they confront certain facts that they had never heard of before, right? And sometimes, there's a reaction to it in a negative way. They feel that it's ideology that's being taught to them, right?
I mean, it's disturbing to them, and at the same time, one has to admit, why do many people go to Columbia, to Harvard, to Yale, to Brown? Why do their parents invest money in that? because they want the stamp that they went to these institutions to do well later on in their careers. So they are young people and they're idealistic and they do think about that, and then they move on. And they go to law school or they go to some other corporate entities and they join the elites. That's what the universities do. They reproduce elites, economic elites, political elites. So in order to change that, you have to change the places where you're recruiting students so that they come with these memories, with these histories, so that they represent that. Not that they just feel bad about it having happened. They know that it happened to their own families. That's the first generation students that you're talking about. I was first generation. My wife was first generation. My wife's mother was illiterate. And she became a professor at Harvard. There was a system in Hong Kong at the time when she was growing up that made for social mobility, but it was based on merit. So it's the old Chinese system also. So you had to come first or second. But if you did, then your education was paid for until the next exam. So if you were smart and you worked hard and you had support from your family, you could move up. That's very hard now.
Yes, because I think there's no contradiction between merit and inclusion. They are not opposite. There must be no opponents. If you have merit, it won't be inclusion because you need both of them. I don't know how, but you need both of them.
Well, yes, but of course, part of the problem is that if you come from an underprivileged background, even the idea that you would one day go to Harvard doesn't occur to you. It's not part of your horizon of expectations, and you will not have the kind of education and the kind of support that would facilitate that, even if the idea occurs to you, which usually it wouldn't. That's the problem. So how do you change that? You cannot change it at the top. Yeah. I mean, I hate sounding like a Marxist, but you have to change it in the infrastructure.
The other issue is. I agree that there's an organic link between inclusivity and merit. And the reason for that is one of the most important things that we have to think about is what are the topics that scholars choose to study, particularly in the humanities. Yeah. And I think the great revolution in social history teaches us this, that, in the 19th century, the assumption was that history was the history of great men, right? Now, history is focused on the micro. And you could write a history of African-American businesses in the segregated South. That wouldn't have been a topic of history in the 19th century. How did it get there? Because there was a political movement to force universities to accept African-Americans. Right?
There was ideology.
Yes,
yes.
and
that was
broke
good.
Through. It broke through to make the field more concerned about merit, because suddenly things that had not seemed to be important for historians, now we realize, yes, it is actually very important. It is very important for us to understand the social dynamics of history as experienced by marginalized populations, right? That's one reason why it's important to open up the doors of universities to different kinds of people. Because the reality is people oftentimes, what they prioritize in terms of their study is shaped by their own personal histories. And so if they're never given an opportunity to pursue those under the conditions of scholarly rigor, those stories will never get told, right?
Of course.
And so we will be deprived of that kind of meritorious scholarship.
Dorian, I wonder your take on that, the opening up, the widening, really, of the fields of study that now are on offer. Does that feel like activism to you, or does that feel like an exploration of people being allowed to think critically and learn to think critically?
So from a scientific perspective, it's definitely good to open up the number of people who can join the sciences to provide better education, more access to education, and to consider all kinds of different people. I have, in terms of the merit that Omer mentioned, I had a postdoc from China, and he grew up as a rice farmer. And as a kid, he just did really well on some exam. So he went to the best university in China, and then he ended up at University of Toronto for his PhD, and then a postdoc at Chicago, and then back to the best university in China, which is Peking University. And so that's an example of how these types of exams can really pick out people who are ready to achieve at a high level. And I definitely support that and think we should improve education to do things like that. I currently have a graduate student who hated high school, did terrible. He became a steel worker and a soldier in the Army National Guard, like the reserve forces. But he did well on tests, like IQ tests in the Army, so they made him a mechanic, which is a high-level intellectual job in the Army. He did very well at that. He went to community college, then he went to State University in Massachusetts, got a physics degree, and now he's getting a PhD at the University of Chicago. And so we should definitely try to encourage all those sorts of things as much as possible.
So in encouraging those types of things, what's the best way to do it and still allowing this open space for critical thinking? Omer.
Well, look, I want to say that we seem to all agree on merit. The problem with that is that it doesn't always produce the results you would like it to produce. The idea of succeeding through merit, which was introduced by Napoleon in France, produced new elites of merit. And elites like to preserve their power as elites, so they send their children to the same schools that they went to. France has the grandes écoles, and in France, people speak about it as being like 20% of the population is part of that system. And if you went there and your uncle went there and your father and your grandfather, then you also are likely to enter because you have merit. But that merit becomes also inherited merit. And one problem that we have...
Inherited merit. So is it still merit if it's inherited?
Obviously not. But you grew up in a house full of books, and people always talk over the dinner table about literature or philosophy, and so you picked it up. And even if you're not the smartest in the family, you know how to speak, you know how to present yourself. This was the same in Britain. Who went to Eton? Who went to rugby? But these were people who... Supposedly they were smarter, but they just came from the right families. They came from the right background. So there is a problem, and that problem is reflected now in the fact that the university now, in much of the Western world, in Europe, in the US, in Israel too, is talked about by elements in the right, and certainly by populist politicians, as enclaves of the elites. That we have to dismantle. And that's, of course, political and ideological talk, but it's not entirely vacuous. There is something within that sort of self-recruitment. That's where, first generation comes in, but there's much more rhetoric about first generation, the real first generation. There's less and less of it. So I am very much in favor of merit, but how do you find that? How do you produce a situation where meritorious people, where smart children actually get a chance to show that they're smart in places where nobody would give them an opportunity? How do you create that sort of avenue for people to rise up? And that has changed, and we see there is a diminishing social mobility. And that produces, to my mind, if you want to look at why we are in the political situation that we're now in, whether it's in Germany or in Italy or in France or in Britain or in the United States, it has to do with the fact that people feel that they're not getting the fair break. That's something that has not been addressed by the left or the Democrats or the Social Democrats. They have failed to address this issue.
I think there are several problems with merit. Now, I'm not saying that I don't believe that merit exists, but there are problems with it. First is, how do you define merit? Merit is, I think, very contextual. When I started law school, in my small section, our class was divided into something like 10 small sections of 25 each. There was a classmate that had a PhD in physics, another that had a master's in computer science from Princeton. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to compete with these brainiacs, right? well, it turns out I did much better in law than they did, right? They could probably do much better in these other disciplines than I would, right? So merit isn't necessarily across the board, right? In terms of just ability to do a certain task, if you define it as an ability to do a certain task. But is that the right way to define merit? Maybe the right way to define merit is how much difficulty you've had to overcome to get where you are, because a line isn't the endpoint. The line is the distance between where you started and where you ended up. But university admissions, oftentimes, it's just looking at people at where they are at a specific moment in time, right? But it may very well be that a student who has had to overcome much more, even though his endpoint objectively is a couple hundred points less on the SAT, maybe it's a B average instead of an A average, maybe that person has actually shown a lot more grit and ability to work through obstacles that will serve him well in a life of knowledge than another person who was sort of born with a silver spoon in his mouth and his entire life was all his activities were structured and geared toward admission to an elite school, right? And then finally, there's a question of, do we want to produce a system that produces geniuses, or is it a system that wants to have breadth?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
What's your answer?
I think you obviously need to have a little bit of both. It sounds stupid, but you need to have a system. The story of the Chinese rice farmer, et cetera, I like to think of that as the Darwinian model of education, that we're only going to care about the most successful and the geniuses. To me, that's not an educational system. To me, an educational system, the best educational system is the best at improving the lot of the median student, because I kind of feel like geniuses thrive wherever they may be. But a really good educational system is one that takes the median student and makes him or her a lot better than she would have been but for the system. And I think that's how we should sort of judge our educational infrastructure.
A couple points. There's a lot I agree with in that. One point, though, about the rice farmer, if they don't have the tests, he stays a rice farmer.
I agree. I understand. I'm not saying that.
As smart as he is, he's using his knowledge for rice farming rather than physics. And so that's why I think those tests are important. I definitely agree with your point that you want to find people on a trajectory to achieve, not just what they happen to be at 18 or 22 when you do graduate school admissions, or at 28 when you do junior faculty hiring. What I have advocated for undergraduate admissions is to define an objective function. Like, this is what we call a success, whether it's grades or postgraduate something. This is a success. Take your input data and then build a model to predict it, and then do longitudinal studies and update your model. And I would actually make everything anonymized and public and say, look, if you can come up with a better predictor than we have, we'll use that for our admissions next time. And so if you can find one of these momentum variables, like you're describing, that suggests a trajectory that's upwards, if someone can find that in the data, that's great. And that would be something that falls out of it. And so that's the sort of thing that I think would help a lot with making things fairer. And it relates to a point that you made, which is that there's some shenanigans going on in the admissions office. And I've often felt, so it's completely opaque. We don't know, faculty don't know how admissions happens at these elite universities. We're not allowed to know. They don't tell us. They won't even give us any of the data anonymized so we can study it. And so I think part of what's going on there is they know they're playing games with donors' kids, and they're letting in students who wouldn't otherwise get in. And so they keep it.
Of course.
Yeah.
So much of this conversation, Pablo, is focused on the elite schools in the U.S., in North America. Do you see parallels to this in Argentina and other parts of the world?
Well, there are some parallels, and there are not, of course. In Argentina, the Latin America, but mostly Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, the public systems are very big. The discussions on admissions, in the biggest university in Argentina is the University of Buenos Aires. It has it doesn't have exams. You must approve a course that it takes a year after secondary school, and And once you approve, then you start the career or the orientation you want. That brings a lot of discussion, of course, because it's quite democratic, but it's too expensive too. The first year is the one that takes the biggest amount of money, the biggest number of professors. So, but and it also didn't. It hadn't brought equally because it went more for the middle classes, but not for the poor. That they don't want, they don't imagine to go to university. So the university title has lost some of its value too. There's common said in Argentina that an architect is driving a cab or something like that, things like that, no? And so postgraduate studies are now the elite in a way, not to go to universities, but also there's another I think important thing that happened in recent years, that there was a creation of public new universities near smaller, but near where middle and lower class live. So I don't know where it's going to bring us, but the problem is on the table. I think is of the democratic access and to university studies. Of course, I'm first generation of universities in my family, a family that as many families in Argentina are made by Jewish and Italian and Spanish and mixture of origins. But I think there are some points that are similar, some questions we are discussing here, and some others that we see as with big eyes. What are these people discussing of?
Right.
But they're very interesting and of course.
Some parts very unique to the United States. You've also had experience outside of the U.S. and those elite institutions. Do you see parallels?
Look, I mean, I taught at the State University in New Jersey, at Rutgers University. That was a very different experience from after I moved to Brown. So first of all, I saw both systems, and I have to say that what struck me at Rutgers at the time, which is a great school, was how ill-prepared the undergraduates were. That people came to study with me, and I teach history, and people read and write. It was very hard for many of the students to read and write. The elite was sort of creamed off and sent to Princeton, and I had some brilliant undergraduates, and I had some undergraduates who really needed a few more years in high school, but in a good high school, which obviously they hadn't attended. And when I came to Brown, I could see the difference. And that just gives you, first of all, an idea that when you talk about the university in the United States, it means different things in different places. It's not the same institution. I went to Oxford in 1980, and that was right after Maggie Thatcher started a revolution in the university system in Britain, which was very late compared to other European countries. It opened up the university. And we have to remember, we speak about the university as a sort of modern phenomenon, but the universities around the world opened up after World War II, from a few tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of students. And at Oxford, it happened late. What did that mean? Well, many people will tell you to this day in Britain that it dumbed down education, that people suddenly were at Oxford who, again, couldn't really read and write very well, that they didn't know their own literature, that they didn't know their own history, because they hadn't gone to these elite schools. But they will also tell you that the society tapped into vast amounts of talent that had not been tapped before because of that system. I was in the transition point, and it was very interesting for me to see that, how this was changing at the time. But my undergraduate education was in Israel, and I have to say that, and obviously I'm so personally engaged in that because I grew up in that country and because I'm watching what is happening in that country right now. The change that has happened in Israeli universities, to my mind, is extraordinary. And in part, it's because of an opening up. So there are far more universities in Israel now than there were when I went to university there. In part, it's a reflection of the change of society. But to see how the university became a place where faculty are afraid of the students, are afraid of speaking. It's not truth to power. It's truth to their own students, because students are sitting there with their cell phones and they can at any moment take a video of you and it'll be on the evening news and you will be destroyed. The change from a student body when I was there in the 70s that was leftist, generally speaking, that most of the students lamented. I remember that very well. 1977, Menachem Begin became prime minister. It was the first right-wing prime minister in Israel, and people had watched the election campaign all night on TV and came in and they were mourning. They said, our country has been stolen from us, because they came from the group, also the social group, and the ethnic group, if you like, from more Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews, and they felt that they lost it, that now the prime minister is coming from the other side of society. To see the change from that to today, where the student body, people are less well educated, speak their own language quite badly, and very right-wing, and are intimidating the faculty, which is adapting to that. That, to me, that change, in one way, it's a welcome change. You have to say more elements of society went to university, and they're reflected now. That's a good thing. But it got distorted into something that is now a politics of racism, of exclusion, of violence, of militarism at the university, within the student body, and the faculty, some of whom are remnants of the way I remember the university, are mostly afraid to speak out and are not supported, of course, by their own administration. That, to me, it humbles you. It makes you say, okay, we need to open the universities, we need to give more opportunities, but we also need to know the repercussions to all of this. And the repercussions are, again, to my mind, because you have to think, where are those people coming from? Where are the students coming from?
Maybe because there are two times happening at the same time. The university, as Mohammad said, are coming from, or you said, are coming from centuries ago. But the students are coming just for the present, just for the present, with their cell phones, the IA access, and that is really challenging everything. As
that's true.
Know.
That's true. And just to say, that's something that we haven't spoken about. But the change, even in the last 2-3 years, not just a cell phone, but with AI, and which is sort of outside of politics. But of course, nothing is outside of politics. We don't even know where it's going. But I know that like 30% of the papers that I got from a class of 100 students last year were identified as generated by AI. And that was a class about genocide.
Oh my gosh.
At Brown.
At Brown.
Okay, Professor, I'm going to pause you there because you opened up this box of so many things that we could get into, and I know everyone wants to
Pandora's
jump in.
box.
A Pandora's box.
I think a lot of people reminisce or romanticize a time when universities were more selective.
Yes.
So I'll speak, I'm Egyptian. I was born in Egypt, but my family immigrated to the United States when I was 3 years old. Our first night was at Hyde Park because my father had a fellowship at University of Chicago. And so a lot of Egyptians, sort of elite Egyptians, will have nostalgia for the days when universities were truly elite, right? And then they were ruined when Abdel Nasser opened it up to everybody. That's sort of the conservative narrative. I don't want to disagree that there were certain downsides to making universities much more egalitarian, sort of across the board. But I think what that indicates is that societies have a hard time doing two things simultaneously. One is opening up more opportunities for higher education and then making the investments necessary so students can succeed at higher education. Right? In order to succeed in the university, you need to have a certain kind of preparation in your primary and middle and high school education. And only speaking for the United States, we have done a very bad job of educating the general public and preparing them for higher education. One of the most interesting statistics is a large number of students will enter university or higher education and not complete their degrees because they are incapable of doing the work required of them. And that goes to, I think, a big structural failure. We underpay our teachers. We don't invest enough in high school education. And to me, this is a political problem, which I still don't understand exactly. Why is it that we are so indifferent to the skills of our citizens? We should want our citizens to flourish, to be prosperous, to give them more skills, and we should view that as an investment, not an expense. But our politics always views spending money on education as an expense, and so we immediately chop it, right, because of fiscal restraints. But that's sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face, in my opinion, right? So I don't think the problem is expanding university education. The problem is underinvesting in education in earlier years so that students can succeed.
So I mentioned that you opened up this box. There were several things in it. One of the things that piqued my interest was when you talked about how the student body has the ability to pull out their cell phones and record the professor and make that professor's life change immediately. Dorian, you have some experience. We touched on earlier that experience. I wonder what you make of what that means for the climate of both protest, of free speech, of openness to debate ideas.
So I don't allow electronic devices in my classroom. I want my big lecture class is actually, it's an estimation class. So I'll ask people questions. I'll just come in and say, how many people are flying over the continental United States right now? You've got 5 minutes. And then they, pencil and paper, try to come up with a way to estimate. There are certain techniques you can use, and it's a very useful skill to have to keep people from tricking you, either journalists or politicians or whoever, to be able to estimate, is this person BSing me or not? It's a core class for non-scientists. Anyways, so if they could have cell phones, that would defeat the purpose. So they can't use any electronic devices. And so I don't have that. It's definitely an issue now. People getting set up and then a video being taken and cut and presented out of context. I mean, you mentioned AI. You could also AI fake videos. So someone didn't even say the thing. It's one thing if they say it and you cut it up, but it's another thing if they didn't even say it and you just invented it. So that's an issue that we should all be aware of.
But aside from the vehicle for what they're doing, the actual act that they disagree with what this professor is saying, and thus they want the world to know, then the world will take action. Talk to me about what that has actually felt like on a campus.
Well, okay, so the best example in that direct vein is about 5 years ago, we had a class at the University of Chicago called The Problem with Whiteness. And one student in the class posted it on Twitter and said, I have a problem with this class or whatever. And then that professor got a lot of email hate as a result of this. And so then the university had to say, well, what do we do about this? It turned out in that situation that what the student had done was considered legitimate extramural speech. All he did was post the course syllabus and say, I don't think this is an okay class to have. And they just offered the class 6 months later, and no one disciplined anyone in that specific case. But that's the sort of thing that it happens a lot now.
Well, I would like to sort of update our priors on this, because I think a professor at Texas A&M was fired after a student protested some discussion of gender in a class and took a video of it, and the video went viral, and politicians at Texas got involved.
And then the president
and
the provost
just ended up resigning. And so this is, obviously, you can disagree with what the professor is lecturing, right? You can say, no, I think that this is wrong. That's perfectly within the bounds of academic freedom. But to then fire the professor and then pressure the university president to resign because of what was taught in the class is a egregious violation of academic freedom. And unfortunately, that's where we are in the United States.
Just one thing, can I add to that, is that with academic freedom for extramural speech outside the classroom, there's generally accepted total freedom of speech.
Total freedom.
Within
so
the First Amendment in the
U.S. We
US.
must talk about Gaza, and we must talk about Israel here.
Well, let me just say one more thing about that. But within the classroom, it must be focused on the domain. So I teach physics and mathematics, and there's a reasonable expectations on my students that they're going to come in there, I'm going to talk about physics and mathematics, not my political views on the president or any other issue. And so that's an important distinction that we should make.
Yeah. And I hear the distinction between inside and outside, and I'm so curious on you all's views. We have seen both faculty and students who have been targeted for speaking out in support of Palestine. That doesn't necessarily always have to be about what they're teaching in the classroom. It can be about whether they have joined a sit-in or whether they have protested what they posted on social media. International students have been arrested and detained for their views. And despite continued support for Gaza, there are still voices who want to silence those people on these college campuses. Who should get to decide and who shouldn't?
The donors, no.
That's who gets to decide. Yeah.
Right. Mohammad.
I'm sorry. I think, what Dorian mentioned is very important. Freedom of speech is not academic freedom, and academic freedom is not freedom of speech. In various points, they overlap, right? But they are not the same. So academic freedom is the right to engage in research and to teach publicly, right? But it is accountable. It's accountable to your scientific peers, right? Freedom of speech is something that's asserted generally in the United States against the government. So I might, for example, have freedom of speech to use all sorts of racial slurs as a matter of American law, but I don't have the right to use racial slurs in the classroom against my students, because that violates my responsibility as a teacher, and I can be properly disciplined for that. And no one can say, what about your freedom of speech? No, because you have violated your role as a professor. Now, if as a professor, do professors lose their rights as citizens? No, of course not. So if a professor such as myself has a presence on social media and he or she expresses political views, right? I think what has happened since October 7th, actually before October 7th, is that there have been attempts to discipline professors for their views as citizens, right? And that's very problematic, right? Even if you have the most noxious political views, if you are professional in your classroom and professional in your research, right? Those should be totally separate domains. That's my view, right? As it turns out, in fact, lots of people are subject to extra pressure for their extramural speech, even though it's not obnoxious, right? And some people have obnoxious views and suffer no consequences, at least from my perspective. And sometimes you have students asking administrators to discipline professors, not because the professors have done anything wrong in the classroom, but because of what they do in their extramural capacity. And again, I think that is unfortunate, but it is a predictable byproduct of the university adopting a kind of consumer mentality where the customer is always right. In reality, the students are the product, not the other way around, because we are forming them for the outside world. So they are the product. We are not the product. They need to understand that they're the product.
But there can be a moment at which a student complains about what a professor said in class, which is not using racial slurs or doing things that professors should not do and should be disciplined for, but for expressing views that student doesn't agree with. And there it becomes much more difficult to make that distinction. For teaching certain things, using literature and maps and whatever you might use in your classroom, but ending up saying things that a particular student disagrees with. And there you can find a student would say, for instance, this professor is anti-Semitic because he's spoken about Palestinians, because he's spoken about the PLO or about Hamas or about Zionism in ways that I don't agree with, and therefore I think this professor is anti-Semitic. That's where that distinction, which you made, which I totally agree with, gets to be problematic, and it depends a great deal, first of all, on the university administration, whether it protects its faculty or not. And secondly, it depends on what you mentioned much earlier on, Mohammad, which is how you define those things. Which definitions do you use for anti-Semitism, for instance? And what we know is that on university campuses, in the spring of 2024, allegations of anti-Semitism were used to silence speech on campus. This was what it was used for. It was not used to protect Jewish students, because many of the students who were protesting were Jewish themselves. It was used as a cudgel to silence speech. And once you use that term to silence speech about Israel, Gaza, whatever it is, you can use it to silence any speech.
If I could just add one thing, because I want to be clear that this isn't exclusively a problem with Zionism, although I think it's, right now it's one of the major irritants. But a few years ago, I think there was an incident at a college in Minnesota involving an art history class where the teacher, in the course of her lectures, put up some slides of miniatures featuring the Prophet Muhammad, right? And so a lot of Muslims don't like that. And so this particular college had a substantial body of Somali Muslims, and they protested vociferously. And the teacher ended up having to resign. She was an adjunct. I think this was outrageous,
yes.
Right? The teacher was not, presenting this material in a way to denigrate Muslim beliefs or anything. She was actually presenting truthful art history, because there were Muslims produced miniatures that included images of the Prophet Muhammad. How could you teach your art history class and not include that, right? So sometimes, unfortunately, administrators don't show the spine that they need to across the board, right? Sometimes it can be because of direct action by students. Sometimes it can be because of action by donors. Sometimes it's because of politicians. So what we need to do is develop governance systems, accountability systems that give administrators the spine they need to defend the university.
Or if I may, just one word on this, because I think this is a really important point, that faculty governance in general has been eroded over time. Across universities, and it's in state universities and elite universities and so forth. So you have administrations, university administrations that are acting by fiat, that are claiming to provide rules of speech, rules of the game, rules of assembly, and so forth, without consulting the faculty, and presenting that to the faculty as the rules that everybody agreed on. And what we see now, I think, is a crisis in that sense, which right now has to do also with the case of Gaza, but as you say, it's a larger issue. That is that faculty have to assert the fact that they are actually the university, that the university is not the president and the provost. Those come and go. It's not even the students. They come and go. It's the faculty. What makes a university is its faculty. If the faculty go, then you won't have any administrators, you won't have any students, you'll have just empty buildings. And faculty have forgotten that that's actually their role, to govern their university. And it's gone over to donors, to corporations, and also now to the government.
Yes, because all this atmosphere, the worst result it could have is that the faculty will censor itself.
Yes.
Just in order to, I don't want trouble with my students, I don't want trouble with my donors, I don't want troubles. So, and that's the way, and that has happened many times in history. And that's a very, very, very huge problem, because as we talked earlier, universities reflects the state of societies in many ways, and this is one of those ways.
I wonder if you have felt that pressure to censor yourself, because earlier you were talking in slight hypotheticals there that this could happen, but it happened to you. You walked into a lecture that you were planning to give. This was in Israel, and you were met with protests.
Yeah, look, I mean, what happened to me in Israel was, yes, I did come to give a lecture, but it was a guest lecture. I'm not a member of the faculty of Ben Gurion University. I was hosted by someone who is. And yes, my lecture was disrupted. It was impossible to hold a lecture. It ended up actually being a very interesting event for me, because the students who were protesting had received a WhatsApp message the day before saying that I had said that there was genocide in Gaza. I actually hadn't said it yet at that point. At that point, I actually had warned that it might become genocide. Shortly thereafter, I did say that, but it wasn't at that point.
And just putting it on the record here, you are a scholar of genocide. You
Yes.
are a genocide historian.
Yes, an historian of the Holocaust and of war crimes. And what the first thing that happened was that the students who were protesting were shouting, "We are not murderers," which to me was a very interesting and powerful moment, because they understood that they were being accused, or might be accused, of genocide. And these students, although they were students, had just come back, most of them, from reserve service in Gaza. So they were in civilian clothes, but they had just come back. And eventually, after about an hour of disruption, we decided to just let them in. And we let them all in, and we said, look, I'm not going to give a lecture, let's just talk. And we talked for about 2 hours. And for me, that conversation was quite revealing, quite interesting, quite important. And what I felt was that nobody had spoken with these students. Now, the university administration refused to take any responsibility for this event. The hosting professor complained to the university. He said, look, I mean, what about this guy couldn't hold a lecture? I invited him. And they said, well, we protect freedom of speech. So they were with bullhorns and kicking the doors and all of that. And he said, okay, we are just protecting freedom of speech, of the students, not mine, of course. But I felt that these students had not had an opportunity to speak about their experiences. And now this gets to me personally, because after I sat down with them, I told them, look, I was also in the army. In fact, I served 4 years in the army. I was a combat soldier. I was a company commander. I was wounded in service. That calmed them down a bit, because I was less of a traitor, right? I was not somebody sitting in my air-conditioned room, as they say in Israel, and criticizing all these sweaty soldiers out in the field. So there was a sort of moment of recognition. I'm much older than them and all that, but I also had that experience. That has protected me much more than many, many of my colleagues in the United States as well. because I wrote about the Holocaust, because I served in the IDF, because I'm Jewish and I'm Israeli. So it's a bit harder, not impossible, because I've received a lot of hate mail saying that I'm a capo and I'm a self-hating Jew and all kinds of stuff. But nonetheless has given me some protection. I'm also old. I'm about to retire. I'm a full professor. But the intimidation has to be acknowledged. There's massive intimidation of students, graduate students who are terrified, and I know some of them, not only by politics in Gaza, but all the visa policies now, and of faculty, both junior faculty, but also tenured people who still have their careers ahead of them. And we know now that you can fire tenured professors. A private university can fire a tenured professor. The professor can sue it if she can afford to. But they can fire people. And so people have begun watching the speech. They are careful. And all of this, specifically on these issues, began in the spring of 2024. And it's an ongoing process, which of course encompasses way more than the case of Gaza. It is a kind of new enforcement of speech rules that university administrations are complicit in, are taking part in, and we see Columbia, what Columbia did now, we see what Berkeley did now, with sending names, 160 names, and will encompass anything that the current political culture doesn't like. And once you do that at the university, well, you're back in McCarthyism.
Dorian, what are your views on this? What counts as acceptable speech on a campus?
Well, I think there's a lot of, tradition on that. It's things that aren't inciting violence or that aren't interfering with other people speaking. Right. That's not a free speech principle. That provost or president, whoever, had not thought about things carefully if he said that.
Which one?
Yelling at a speaker is not permitted by, any normal version of academic freedom, so that the speaker can't speak. That provost was confused.
Is that a particular issue? I don't remember.
You mentioned
the one you mentioned in Israel.
Oh, you mean in my case?
That your free speech wasn't protected, but theirs was.
That administrator was confused. That was a bad excuse.
I don't think he was confused.
He just was intimidated.
He wasn't confused. In fact, that's an interesting thing, because this president and provost were among the protesters during the judicial coup, the judicial overhaul. So that's in Israel between January and October 2023. There were many demonstrations because the government was seen as threatening the rule of law in Israel, as weakening the Supreme Court and so forth. Yeah. And they were protesting against it. Once the war began, after October 7th, they became patriotic. Mm-hmm. And so what they are doing, in fact, was completely ideological. I had an exchange with them. With these two individuals on email, and they're just seeing me as being, not patriotic, as complaining about a justifiable war against a nasty enemy. So they covered it up by saying freedom of speech, but that was obviously and overtly not actually what they were thinking about.
But in an academic context, on panels and lectures, I want to hear the most extreme versions from either side. That's what I want to see on campus. I thought this issue would come up. So
You're a right-wing communist.
I thought this issue would come up, so I did a little research on it. But first, I just wanted to acknowledge it's a terrible human tragedy that's going on. And God loves everyone. And when any human being is killed, it's a terrible tragedy. Personally, I visited the Weizmann Institute in Israel 4 times, and I have a lot of respect for my faculty colleagues there. But I also, when I was there, I worshipped many times at St. George Church in Lydia with Arabs, and I also lectured at Birzeit University near Ramallah. And so I have a little bit of exposure, but as an outsider, to see how I think something that's often lost with Americans is how complex this issue is, and how much of a tragedy is in the true sense of that it's very difficult to solve this problem. Anyways, so
you're opening up a second Pandora's box there, but I do want your thoughts
right.
specifically.
So
on...
I've had a lot of people with a pro-Israel view telling me they've been censored, and people with a pro-Palestinian view telling me that they've been censored. So I went to the FIRE database on deplatforming, which is just, they try to collect every time that a speaker at a university has been prevented from speaking, to see what the data say on this. And so I found 526 deplatforming events since 2022. It's obvious why I chose that year. Of these, 203, or 39%, involved the Israel-Palestine conflict. So that means that this is really one of the most sort of hot issues right now, that people are getting deplatformed from it. Of those 203, 84, which is 41%, had a pro-Israel perspective, and 119, which is 59%, had a pro-Palestine perspective. Now, I don't know the base rate of invitations in terms of were there more pro-Palestine invitations or more pro-Israel invitations, but what it seems to me is that this is an issue where people are very excited and very angry about. There is representation of both sides on campus, and both sides are engaging in canceling. And so it's a case where I think the university leadership should engage in some education about sort of our rules of engagement with how we discuss issues with people, that we don't shout them down, that we don't try to prevent lectures and things like that. So that's sort of my overall perspective.
I just want to say one thing in agreement. One problem that I've seen at universities since October 7th in particular is that many universities were afraid to talk about this. We're afraid to organize events where these are universities, they're teaching institutions, they're supposed to talk about things. And as we said before, about things that are controversial, that are difficult. And they have the experts there. They pay them nice salaries to actually be able to talk and explain what is going on. And they have been very timid about doing that. And that's because of fear that it might not be understood. But the result is that when you don't do that, then you are opening your flanks up to extreme speech on one side or on the other. I was lucky. I had at the time the head of the Watson Institute at Brown, which is now the school, it's not the institute, but at the time it was still the Watson Institute. After October 7th, he knew that I was involved in that, and he put up some funds for me. And between late October 2023 and April 2024, I hosted 19 events at Brown. But these were not big public events, and people had to register and to come, and I would make a little speech at the beginning that we are here to learn about this. We have different people coming, and we can ask them questions. They'll talk about this, but they're just to explain to us how they understand what is going on in a civilized academic atmosphere. Now, did it diffuse all the tensions? Of course not. But it was an attempt to do something so that we actually use the opportunities we have in academic institutions to learn and to understand. And so much of that has not happened. So people are being deplatformed. And look, I mean, we don't even know what that reflects. I know in my case that my audience has changed completely. Because I used to be a Holocaust scholar, so I would be invited by all kinds of people interested in the Holocaust, often Jewish communities. It happens much less now. I don't know that I was deplatformed. I just don't get invited, right? Yeah. So we don't know. There's so much of this happening, but obviously it's exactly the opposite of what we want. We want to be able, certainly at the university.
Because if I could comment on this, if I could comment on this, I'm in a law school. Right. One of the things that we do is international law. We've had no events as a faculty, for example, discussing the decisions of the International Court of Justice. You would think that it's significant that the International Court of Justice issued a series of preliminary orders against the state of Israel, to cease and desist from committing acts that plausibly threaten the Palestinians of Gaza with genocide. Now, it's not the case that we as law professors automatically genuflect to judicial opinions. It's quite common the case that, in fact, we are very critical of judicial decisions. But the fact that we haven't even had a discussion of it, I think, speaks volumes.
Why was that?
I don't know. I'm not and I can say confidently that this is the case also in other elite law schools. There's been complete silence on even recognizing this is a question to be discussed. I have a colleague at another
I wonder, Mohammad, I just want to pause you
Yeah.
there, because before you go on, you say there's been complete silence. Pablo raised something earlier about the self-censorship. Have there been moves from the faculty to say...
This is what I would say about that. So a colleague of mine at another top 10 law school in the United States confided in me that there is complete terror. Terror is the word he used to describe the feelings of his colleagues about talking about Palestine, that you will only mention it in private with people with whom you have complete trust, or on private email, right? You won't use your university email for anything, because there is fear. And this was even before Trump. This was during the last year of the Biden administration, right? And so I don't know of any issue, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, that in which faculty is terrified to speak to the extent that they have been since October 7th, right? Even when it's within the core of their concerns as law professors. You would think that whether or not genocide is taking place is a core concern of law professors who are committed to teaching the rule of law, international law being an important part of that. That fact that American law professors, North American law professors, are disabled from saying anything about it, either way, is, I think, shocking.
Yeah, that's shocking. This idea of police of ideas, police of expressions, police of words, police for everything, it's a culture we are living that it's against knowledge. It's against pluralism. It's against diversity. It's against all the things we have been discussing today. When you can say a word, when you cannot say, cannot touch an issue of the importance of Palestine, Gaza, Israel, and that's what we are seeing also here in Latin America. Don't talk about that. Don't get yourself in trouble. You don't know what's going to happen. If this is happening here so far away from Middle East, and I can't imagine what made us as a society, as a civilization, to go to this, to go so far on that. As Omer said, one remembers now the time of political correctness with nostalgia, because it seemed, well, you cannot say black people, you must say African American people. Well, that was an advance in a way. But now we cannot talk, we cannot say, we just must keep silent. We are going to keep silent. That is not the world I thought it.
Can I say a couple points on that?
Please, Dorian.
So I actually see that what you're saying is an important point, that this is currently the most important issue.
Yeah.
But I've heard other professors telling me they're afraid to talk about the trans issue, and they're in terror, and they use private emails. And of course, this is a very, people have very hot feelings about that, and there's going to be another issue in 5 years. And so this confluence of technological development, social media, AI, it's led to a situation where a lot of these issues can really explode like this. And so we have to be cognizant of it.
But Dorian, I agree that some issues surrounding sex and gender have been very stress-inducing, particularly in terms of how we talk about it publicly. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but at least in my field in law, something happened, I guess, in the spring of 2024 that I think is completely unprecedented. Yeah. The Columbia Law Journal wanted to publish an article about the Nakba, the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine in 1947, 48, and 49. The trustees intervened to shut down the website
and it started
of the Law
at Harvard,
Journal.
thing.
Yeah, that article started in Harvard. The Harvard Law Journal initially accepted it. After it went through everything, pressure was put on the Harvard Law Journal not to publish it. Yeah. It went to Columbia.
Sure.
The university intervened to shut down the website.
Yeah, so we've had plenty of examples of that in a variety of fields with the highest scientific journals related to the trans issue.
Okay, educate us.
Well, so like we had there's a famous actually this one's in the feminist journal, I think it's called Hypatia, that they retracted an article afterwards from pressure because of the transposition that it took. There was an article by Hudlicki in the chemistry journal. In this case, it was over DI stuff that was retracted because.
But was it the university that did it?
What?
Was it the university that did it?
Well, I mean, if it's Nature is revoking the paper, is that
No, I'm not saying but it's different when the university itself is the one doing it as opposed to a publisher. I mean, which is bad. It's bad enough. But when a university does it, it's extraordinary.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary.
But there was one issue I wanted to bring up about. So I proposed it was actually 2022. A lot of these terms like genocide and just war were being used. And I felt that I didn't know really what they meant very well. And a lot of the students didn't know what they meant very well. So I proposed to the president that we have some sort of event where we invite experts in these things and discuss them, so we at least knew what we were talking about when we talked about it. And the attitude was just sort of like, no one's going to listen to us.
Really?
You know, there's no point trying to educate people because they're all just going to yell at each other, and I don't want to inflame the situation.
That's the president of the university?
Yeah, and so that was at least the attitude there.
That's extremely sad. I mean, look, as I said last year, I taught the class on genocide, and I insist on getting all the terminology correct, and it's really important. And you see, students, they may have opinions, but they actually also want to learn. They actually listen to you, and if nobody tells them, then how should they know? You need someone who happens to know. Explain to them certain things about what is genocide, what are war crimes, what are crimes against humanity. But I want to say one thing that, I mean, listening to you on this kind of fear and silence, how dangerous that is. Because when you say, we don't know why a law school didn't have anything, people are fearful. People are fearful in Argentinian universities to speak about this. We don't know exactly what they're afraid of, but they're afraid of. And that's talking about Israel committing genocide. You use anti-Semitism, allegations of anti-Semitism to silence speech. What do you expect would be the result of that, of this fear-mongering about not being critical about the state of Israel? Who is behind that? It's clear that this is creating, repeating an old conspiracy, right? This ends up, or somebody is behind that. We can't even say who we're afraid of, but there's something lurking in the background. It must be the Jews.
Yeah.
That's what and I've said that repeatedly. When you use allegations of anti-Semitism to shut down speech, or when you intimidate law faculties, these students at Harvard, this was, I followed that case closely, and I know the guy who wrote that essay too. I spoke with him at length, Rabia. You are opening the path to an old conspiracy theory that is in any case now resurgent on the American right, on the European right, in the far right. Instead of, the only way to stop that is to shed light on things, is to talk about them openly. And those people don't do it because they're afraid for their reputations. I mean, what can happen to tenured law faculty if they do talk? Nothing will happen to them. Some of their friends will be mad at them. Maybe some members of their family will be angry at them.
Well, you
That's
mentioned
all.
earlier they could get fired. Is that enough of a threat to not talk?
Okay, so yes. It may happen, and I wanted to say that academics in general, historically, have not been the bravest. Academics have usually been, timid and often coordinate themselves with the powers that be. You can go to the 1930s.
Woody Allen
and see that
said
happening.
once that they are like the mafia; they kill among themselves.
Yes, exactly. But. If you don't have the courage to speak about what you believe is important, and it's not yes, so there's politics and there's politics. But this kind of politics, if you're a law professor and you see misuse of or covering up of what you know is are major crimes, major international crimes, and you don't speak out, then maybe you shouldn't be a law professor. Maybe you should be fired.
If I could just say, I think it's unfortunately not just timidity. A lot of people, I mean, people being people, some people have ambition, and they feel that by taking a public stance, that will undermine their ambitions. Some of them may justify that by saying, well, you know, when I get elevated to the dean, I'm going to be different, or when I get elevated to provost, I'm going to be different, or whatever the self-justifications are given. But I think that influences a lot of people too, the belief that in order to achieve my professional ambitions, I should just keep my head down.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Something in terms of this fear that you hear expressed, is there a fear that their cell phone's going to blow up? Or they're going to...
No, I don't
It's
think
not
so.
that sort of a fear.
It's not that sort of fear. I think it's the fear of the loss of opportunities, right? Honestly, I think it's the fear of loss of opportunities. I like to say I'm lucky because I have no ambition. And so because I have no ambition, I'm not deterred. You know, but not everybody is ambitionless.
But your main ambition as an academic is to keep your job, first of all. So if you're in threat of losing tenure...
So there is a couple issues there, though. Like, I mean, people have families. And if your family's it's a big threat. If the threat is you're gonna lose your house and your family's gonna starve. And then the other thing is, if you only fire 1 in 10,000 faculty, the other 10,000 they see that and they get in line. And so,
but imagine Dorian, if Newton or Darwin has said, no, I won't say that. It's going to give me some trouble.
But you know what Darwin's story, right? He didn't publish for 40 years. Because he was worried it was going to give him some trouble.
We must wait.
And so, you know, and he actually, I mean, if you read The Origin of Species, he considers every argument and counter argument because he's been thinking about it for 40 years and talking.
No, because that is how knowledge advances. And that was the mission of universities. When silence gets in, I remember during dictatorship in Argentina, the lots of books banned, and modern math were forbidden because they thought that it was a common thing, and so this idea that the most advanced universities, the one we from Latin America admire, the one we would have liked, we would have had the opportunity to study in, the one we visit as if they are, well, museums of knowledge, institutions, venerated institutions, where these things are happening is so painful, and it's incredible that to tell to teach what you learn is. It requires a courage that well, from time to time in history, this seems to happen.
Can I say something about what Omer said?
Please.
So I have a colleague, Lee Jussum at Rutgers, who's Jewish, and I was speaking to him about some of the terms of the Columbia Agreement with the Trump administration and how some of them looked like what we felt was a sort of a DEI for Jews, giving favorable terms for Jews so they didn't have to hear things that made them uncomfortable. And he said, as a Jew, the best thing for me is that the First Amendment is strictly enforced. And I think that sort of speaks to what you're saying about leading to these conspiracy theories if you don't follow that.
Yes, and if you look at the agreement that Columbia made and the agreement that Brown University made, on the one hand, it says there won't be any differentiation at all. So no privileges to anyone. And in the next paragraph, it says, but we will support having a Jewish club and Jewish activities. And so the lawyers who put this together, and I'm sure it was a bunch of lawyers who put it together, don't they see what they're doing? They're saying there's one group that is going to be privileged over all others.
As a lawyer here, I think it's just apropos of the lawless, or let's say the disdain for law that is currently, unfortunately, at play in the United States. And that comes from the top. And so it's not that I think the lawyers are confused about this. I think they know very well what's going on. I think there's a lot of cynicism. I think, and the best interpretation that can be given is that people are hoping this will be a temporary thing and we will get back to normal business, in 3 years. I'm not so confident about that.
Mohammad,
But
I just want to...
legal niceties, the Trump administration has shown that we can run over the formal requirements of Title VI, and we can do whatever we want because nobody can stop us. Yeah. And so what good are these agreements anyway?
Correct.
Right?
Correct. But I just want to say, as somebody who spent several years studying and writing on Nazi Germany, on the Third Reich, the role of lawyers, of judges, and of other professionals such as doctors in putting together and sanctioning the policies of a genocidal regime is blood-curdling. Yeah. That laws were put together to make exclusion, violence, incarceration, and eventually genocide legal. And we always have to remember that the legal profession is about laws, right?
Yeah, I agree. It takes evil lawyers.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I want to raise one more point before we pivot off of this as we head towards the end of this conversation, but one more point on this specifically because I'm sitting at a table with academics, and so we've talked about this from the viewpoint of professors. But I want to bring in the student viewpoint because I want to know what it's been like from your vantage point of what you've seen on your campuses for students on this issue. You two have mentioned you have college-age students, kids yourself. What has this been like when it comes to specifically Gaza?
Well, let me just say there aren't a lot of Arab Muslim students on faculty at the University of Toronto generally or in the law school. So one of the problems that one has as a minority faculty member, and I think this is a common complaint, is that you are in a position where you have to do a lot of mentoring for minority students. Because minority students oftentimes don't feel comfortable sort of expressing themselves and their honest views toward members of majority faculty. And so you get a lot of, you're in a position where you have to do a lot of emotional support for students, just generally. This was true even before October 7th, and which is one reason why I maintain a public profile, because I found that minority students, they find a great deal of solace in the fact that a faculty member will say something publicly that they don't feel they can say in the halls of the university, right? And so it's a burden that minority faculty bear that I think other faculty don't have to worry about. But it's crucial. I mean, we have to do it. Right, and it's very important as a source of support for our students. That's my opinion, but it's stressful.
Yeah, I want to say in the spring of 2024, I taught a seminar on the Holocaust and the Nakba. It's not the first time that I taught it, but because it was the time that it was, many students wanted to take it, and was the only class being offered at the time at Brown that dealt with these issues. And so I had to open it from 20. It was supposed to be capped at 20, and it became more like 40 students. And there were Jewish students, there were Arab students, there were a number of Lebanese students, there were students of Arab heritage. And the class initially, the atmosphere was quite hot, of course, on campus, and I think students were a bit sort of nervous with each other. And we went through the whole history because I'm a historian. So I like to start more or less at the beginning, whatever that might be. So we went through a history of Zionism and of displacement and of 1948. And I have to say that I felt so privileged by being able to speak with this group of students who opened up and became more and more interested and had great conversations. It was so large, this class, that we had to also have sections, and so we had discussion sections. And I'm sure that there were students who hated it and never said anything to me or left. But I felt so fortified in the belief in education, that education is exactly what we said at the beginning of this conversation. It's talking about hard things, but talking about them in a way that you listen to others, that you acquire knowledge, that you actually learn what these things are, from the river to the sea, intifada, all those terms that people have been throwing about without ever explaining what it is. And at the end of this class, I felt that at least with this group of students, something happened. They could speak with each other. So I do believe in this. I think that we can do it. I just worry that the pressures from the outside on academe, and the pressures that we all have of career, of even acknowledgement, are such that we may fail the test.
Can I ask you a question about that class? Because I too teach a class with an Israeli colleague.
Mm-hmm.
It's law focused. It's called the Law of Israel-Palestine. And we started teaching it coincidentally in the fall semester of 2023. And even before we started teaching it, there were some objections raised to it. But the administration sort of, it respected our academic freedom, and so there was no problem. But I think what's happened is that there's been a kind of self-selection into the class. So you get the kind of students who are already predisposed to having an open mind, right? And I'm just curious whether the students you get in your class are representing a real cross-section of the students, or is it already a group that's kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, predisposed to mutual common existence?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a totally valid point. There were a couple of students who were predisposed to me. So there were a couple of students who had already taken previous classes, and I like them and know them. I was worried often in teaching these classes that I was getting more Jewish students than Arab students of whatever heritage they might be, Palestinian students, and there are fewer, of course, on campus anyway. So that always worried me. I have to say I had a worry, and that's something that we haven't spoken about, that there were professors who attracted particular groups of students. And students were building loyalties with one type of professor versus another type, and they were sometimes typed by the ideology. And I did not always manage to overcome that, I have to admit. I don't want to talk about that too much today because that has been, in a sense, exploited by this administration. But there were tensions. Not only on my campus, of course. So yes, there is self-selection, but it's not hermetic. You can break through, and as long as you have 30, 40 students that you talk with, you've gained something. You've done something, and you have to admit that there are many limitations, but you have to try. And I felt that despite everything, and you're right, despite all the selection, which is sometimes simply sort of ethnic, and sometimes it is about opinion, I thought that I was getting through to some people, including one student who's actually a relative of Edward Said, from Lebanon with Palestinian origins. And you felt an opening up and a communication between people who came into their class believing that they were in a particular bubble, and that was the one they felt comfortable in, and yet dare to take the plunge. And if you can do it with a few students, that's better than none.
I want to look towards the future now as we wrap up. I want to look to the future,
Okay.
because we're rapidly running out of time and there's so much to talk about. I'm going to ask an existential question to your jobs, perhaps. Don't be afraid. But we live in a different economic and technological reality than previous generations. And I'm thinking about something we raised earlier, which is this proliferation of artificial intelligence and how that plays into how students learn now, the skills that are needed to be competitive. Do universities still have a place? Do you all still have a need for the types of jobs you bring to this table?
I think even more so. I think in an age where you can get the false sense of knowledge just by typing something into your iPhone or your Galaxy or whatever device you have, the risk of not training people in critical thought is even higher than it was in the 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's crucial if we want to be a self-governing societies that citizens are taught skills of critical thinking, right? And the risk with AI is it will substitute for our ability to think for ourselves. So I think we need to double down on liberal arts, particularly because of artificial intelligence.
A professor I had when I was studying in university said something that I think AI won't displace. He said the most important thing that happened in university it's not happening in the classroom. It happens in the corridors. It happens in the bar. It happens in the library. It happens, and that's a human experience. The access of the information access will change dramatically. It's changing dramatically, but the human experience, that idea when you have something that is like a revelation that challenge your previous thoughts about something, that's a human experience. That's not. I can't imagine AI having that sort of feeling, and pluralism is a polyphony of voices that happens at universities, and so I think many things are going to change. Not that is going to go deeper and deeper, and it won't exclude AI, but it won't be caught by AI.
Dorian.
I agree with what you guys said. And as someone who uses AI in research and trains AI and develops aspects of it, to me, it feels like a really fancy linear regression, not something that's going to be conscious. And so I'm not super worried about that. However,
You had to break that down. What does that mean?
well, it just means it's a way to make predictions from input. You can talk about a linear regression with just, a one-dimensional linear regression is going to make you predictions, and it'll have some correlation with the output data.
So you're popping into your large language model, your ChatGPT, if you will,
Right.
something to try to get it to make a prediction about whatever outcome.
So what it predicts
studying.
is the next word. It gives you a probabilistic forecast of the next word from a sequence of words. And then if you run it multiple times, since it's probabilistic, you'll get a different output. But yeah, that's not consciousness. It's like a linear regression sort of thing. So I'm not really that worried about them becoming conscious and replacing us. But let's consider the asymptotic case that robots and AI can do our whole economy, so that humans can live 100 years on average and be richer than our wildest dreams and have all material things given for, taken care of for us. Well, what are we going to do all day? And so this comes back to the liberal arts. Well, that's just going to make universities even more important and studying philosophy and English even more important if that happens.
Well, I mean, I didn't want to talk about AI actually, but I'll just say one thing, that AI, for instance, is used for translation. And it can translate quite well. But if you think what it may do to translation, you can translate a poem quite well by AI, but you lose what makes that poem unique. So what AI can do is make a lot of information accessible, including literature and poetry, but it does it on a particular level. And that will be, or threatens to become the level. on this, people will write the same way, will think the same way, will express themselves the same way. And what is ingenious about human beings, which is to say something differently, to think this is not the right word for what I really want to put, that's what makes a poem great and different, will disappear. So that's just my take on AI and the humanities rather than for science. But look, I mean, I think that we are living in a period, I think now, that there is so much combination of conformism, of acceptance of things, of a kind of leveling down of everything, and of fear and resentment, that the university is itself threatened by that, and can be, if it's preserved, and I'm not sure that it will, because I think that the university may be taken over by corporations and by administrations and by something that will not be what the university used to be. But if it is preserved to be the place where we can look at our world from another space. This is the safe space. The real safe space is not that we don't challenge each other, but that we can challenge the kind of conformism of the world that we live in now. And we see that, I think, everywhere now. And it's not only in the West. I mean, you see that in China, too. You see it in Russia. It's to preserve a place where people can think separately from all that, can think from, if you like, from another universe, from another planet, and to keep prodding us, everyone else, to understand that that's not the whole truth, that that's not the only way to look at things. Whether that is possible anymore, I don't know, but I think that's, for me, that's the reason to preserve the university as the sort of traditional institution that it once was.
Well, I have a final question for you all, and that allows us to circle back to our original idea. So just in a few words, I want to ask all of you, what is something that university has taught you about truth? Dorian, do you want to start?
Can I go not first?
You're still learning. Yes. Mohammad, why don't you kick us off?
It's such a great question. I mean, I feel I'm biased here because I've lived most of my life in a university. I started when I was 17. I came from a small town in Georgia. My horizons were very constrained. And what I love about my experience, I started off in engineering, then I was in chemistry major, then I ended up majoring in politics. Then I did a PhD in Near Eastern languages, then went to law. I just feel like I'm constantly learning, and that's what I love about being in a university. And so what does it taught me about truth is that I always have to keep an open mind, in that I start off with certain conceptions, convictions, and then as I encounter other people, as I read more, as I listen to new views, I always have to update my priors based on what I'm learning. And so I say this with complete honesty when I tell students, look, I just view myself as a more advanced student than you. Don't think of me as an authority, because I am just learning. There's too much to learn in a human lifetime. So you shouldn't think of me as some master or something. I'm just a little further along the same path that you are trotting. So that's what university life has taught me.
That's beautiful. Pablo.
I've learned two things mainly. The first one is to think against myself, to challenge my own ideas and change them from time to time. To don't be fanatic, to say maybe the other one is saying something that is true, or this book is telling me something that I never thought, and so the second thing that is the second point that is very related with this is to keep curiosity alive. Always be curious. Always there's something you don't know. As you said, always there's another knowledge, another theory, another point of view, a different one that, and knowledge is built on curiosity, and so don't trust yourself so much. Maybe you're wrong, and keep your curiosity always flying.
I made a note because I like that. I need to remind myself of
Thank
that.
you.
Omer.
So first of all, I mean, I think that's a very important point, Pablo. And my first experience with the university was long before the university, because I always wanted to study history. I was always interested in what happened in the past, in any place, always interested me. And at some point I discovered that I could keep doing that and get paid for it. And that for me, so I've also been in academia for most of my life. But on the matter of truth, the way I started my career, really my dissertation, and I think I've stayed in that spot, was always to challenge what was seen as the truth. What was the conventional truth? What was the accepted truth? My dissertation was about the crimes of the German army on the Eastern Front. And you would think, well, we know that the German army committed crimes on the Eastern Front, but in fact, when I started doing it, the convention was that it didn't. And a whole culture in Germany was created on, yes, the Holocaust happened, and it was terrible, and the Gestapo and the SS were doing these terrible things, but not our parents. Our parents were in the Wehrmacht. They were just grunts. They were just fighting, and they were fighting to protect their families, their homeland. Terrible things happened behind their backs. And I didn't believe it, because the Germans killed about 26 million Soviet citizens. It couldn't have been just the Gestapo. Who was doing all this killing? And so I challenged that truth that was completely accepted not only in Germany, but most military historians in America and Britain accepted that. And I started looking at the facts. I started looking at what did reality look like on the ground. And that truth, on the ground, what the soldiers, what the junior officers thought and wrote home and experienced, was completely different from what these generals wrote in their memoirs after the war to present themselves better. And that's something that I think has been my sort of leitmotif always, to see what do most people think about something. And can we look at it differently?
I decided I'm not ready to answer this question. I'm hoping to be active for another 40 years. So you can check in with me.
We'll come back to you in 40 years.
In the 60s, you can check in with me.
You can check with me in 40 years.
Well, I want to thank you all for this conversation. Earlier, Omer, you said that one of the things that a university should do is allow people to talk about hard things, to listen, to explain. I think we did that today. And I'm very grateful to you all. So thank you for joining us. Thank you at home for joining us for this conversation on Doha Debates. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.